welcome Josh Newell to Home is Where the Dark Is. Dude, thank you so much for coming by the studio, and it's great to see you again. We had coffee a few months ago and got to catch up, but I'm happy to have you here now so we can dive into some important things with your career and your productions and your mixes and all that. So thank you, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is actually the first time I've done an in-person podcast. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, everyone's doing the Zooms.
Exactly. A lot of home syncing.
Yeah. So first off, I want to say like congrats on, I've been seeing your work and I've been following your career for a bit now, and I mean, you've been working with some killer artists, and what I really like about your career and your discography is that it's so varied, like everything from pop, from like really like poppy to extreme. So you have like a very vast expansion of work, and I really like producers and mixers and people in the industry who are multifaceted. So congrats so far on your career. Like, you've worked with a lot of great people. So what gave you the drive to go from like musician to wanting to do studio work as an audio engineer? Like, what was that transition for you?
Well, first of all, thank you.
Sure. Sorry, I know I said a lot of stuff in that.
How dare you say these nice things? So I'm originally from Tennessee, and like a lot of people my age, like Nirvana and Metallica's Black Album hit around the time I was turning like 12, 13. So you start playing, and then you learn how to play Inner Sandman, and you work your way back to the catalog. And I just got I was in school band and stuff like that. I'd taken piano lessons, but I just got like kind of really serious about bass guitar. And my high school band director, his like college buddy that came and taught like tuba lessons was also a session musician in Nashville. He played bass. So he's like, "Oh, I'll just bring a bass. We can give you bass lessons." So, I could read music, but he got me up on reading bass and was like teaching me jazz and like kind of getting my technique all proper. And I was like, "Oh, I think like I don't know. I just got really excited about music in my like pubescent years and teenage years. Like, had bands and stuff. And I was like, "Oh, I want to do this. Like, this is what I want to do." And like, I just got really, really serious about bass. And, but then I got realizing like the guy I was taking lessons from was like fourth or fifth call. Like Nashville has a call system, like first tier player, second tier, and like you work your way down. So he's like, "Oh, I do more tuba sessions. I do bass sessions." And he was a phenomenal bass player. And I was like, "Oh man, like that seems like, that's kind of like rough going." My dad actually had a close friend who was a professional flautist at one point. And he was second chair in like the Cleveland Symphony or Cincinnati Symphony or something. And he was encouraged by music stuff, but he was telling me, he's like, "Oh yeah, I realized like no matter how hard I practiced, I was always going to be like second chair flute. I was never going to get better than that." So not like to be defeatist, I realized like, oh, I'm pretty good at this, but I don't think I'm ever going to be like Nashville good, because like Nashville players are ridiculous. But I was like, well, how can I still do music? And I had seen, just because I was super into Metallica in like junior high school, they had a home video about the making of their album. And it was kind of the first time, it's called A Year and a Half Life of Metallica. And like, there was a whole thing with them being in the studio. And I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. Like you can work making music that way. And I did some looking into it. And there's actually a really great couple colleges in Tennessee that like just one of the state schools that's really cheap had like a recording program, and they had a really good music department. So I went and majored in recording and music, and it's like I'll kind of figure it out from there.
Right on. So when you said, I think a lot of people have this mentality, and I believe I might be one of them. When you said, well, I really enjoyed playing bass, but I didn't think I would ever be that good. Like, where do you feel that comes from? Because I think the truth is we have a lot more potential than we realize, I feel like, as human beings. Like, but often we put these ceilings, like these glass ceilings on ourselves, like, well, I really love this, but I'll never be that good. And I deal with this like all the time with myself, with like production, engineering, everything. I'm one of those people that does that to myself. So where do you think that comes from?
I mean, I'm working through that with my therapist right now. Oh. I have like a very loud internal critic, I've learned. The funny thing was, it did, like, part of how I ended up in LA was, at the time when I was like 22 and playing in metal bands, I was like, oh, I don't want to stay in Nashville and do country. And I'd met these people. And I think in hindsight now, I probably would enjoy it. Like you're just working with session musicians all day. So, I moved to LA with my band. It was kind of this like, all right, well, let's play music and let's see what happens. And I started working at NRG eventually. And it did get to a point where I was playing in that band In This Moment, like, and they kind of hit a point where like, we're going to tour until like the record deal. And I was like, it was like a real sit down moment for me because I've been working at NRG for a long time and put all that effort into it. And I kind of went, no, I think production is more what I wanted to do. So there was even a point where I was like, oh, I could have done this. I guess I could have done this professionally at one point and kind of walked away from it. But yeah, I don't know. Like, but the other thing about being in Nashville, like, and kind of starting to get exposed to the session musicians as I was becoming a better player, like, you'd go see someone, I don't know if you know the Wooten brothers, like Victor Wooten or like all those guys. Like, you would just go, like, I just went and you'd see Victor Wooten just playing a club. Like, that is he's incredible, but it's also very discouraging where you're just like, oh, people that are sitting in and playing on that level where you're just like, which I realize now is just being like, oh, that's like thinking that you want to be a basketball player and like you went and saw Michael Jordan play or something, you know what I mean? So I think there was a little bit that too. And I think there was just a little bit of just like being practical in my head, like, oh, my parents are academics. They both taught college on a collegiate level. So there was also that like, oh, you need to get a degree. You need to go do these things. So there was just this idea of, especially at the time, because I went to college in the late 90s. It's like just tons of records were selling. Like Napster hadn't really happened yet. And it was just like, oh, you can just work making music like this too. So I think it was a little bit of that. It was just like, oh man, this is gonna be hard going as a musician. And then just seeing, and just knowing, my stepdad's an amazing musician and he never really made a living at it. He just like,
what instruments did he play?
My stepdad, my mom remarried when I was in my late 20s. So it wasn't like when I was growing up, but he was a guitarist. He played in like the 60s. He just played in country bands. They would just drive somewhere and play. And he has all these great stories about like, oh, reminds me when I was talking to Johnny Cash about this, or he like hung out with, guys like that. Or he's like, oh yeah, I just gave away my 57 gold top Les Paul at one point because I was moving and I couldn't fit in my car.
Wow.
So, but he's an incredible musician, but he never really made like a huge living at it either. So I don't really regret it, but
yeah, I have a lot of thoughts from everything you just said there. One of them is when you said, okay, sometimes we come to these forks in the road in our career where it's like you have two great things happening and you have to decide which path to take. And you had In This Moment that was about to tour, but you had also spent a lot of time, invested a lot of your time in NRG, which, they promote from within. Like every studio, you have to put in your time. And if you spend 2 years there and then all of a sudden like, okay, well, if I leave now and do this tour, I'm going to lose my spot here. Or if I do the tour, like if I stay here, I might, other doors might open for me that could actually be a lucrative career. Cause it's like, you're kind of, we come to these forks in the road. Right. And I think, do you feel that was obviously like you're here now and you've been in the music industry for so long as an engineer, producer, mixer? Like, how do you feel about that choice today? Like seeing how successful In This Moment is.
They've definitely got more successful than I thought they would be. I'm still 100% fine. And I say this, like I'm friends with, I think the drummer's the only one I don't know. Cause like the current, the bassist and the guitarist that were in the band when I wasn't, I've been in other bands with, like, I know those guys. So I'm very happy with it. I wasn't really writing, so I wouldn't have had any publishing. It wasn't like I was kind of the last member to join. And yeah, it was definitely one of those like, and when you kind of mentioned that I worked with a bunch of different artists, I kind of, in really thinking about all of it, I was like, well, one of the things I realized about that I liked at a studio, was that you do work on a bunch of different stuff, especially if you're on staff at a studio like that. Like, hey, Nas is coming in, and then next week we're doing music cues for this country movie. And like that to me was interesting because even playing music growing up, like I had a band that sounded like My Dying Bride at the same time I was in a ska band.
Nice.
Like, and then I played in the marching band in the school jazz bands. Like there was always this like playing a bunch of different types of music. So that was appealing to me as well because of the idea of, and I think it's proven true, like even people in big bands, like look at all the stuff Corey Taylor does on the side from Slipknot. If you're in this band, you're playing that band's material you know, you're out touring one record for 2 years, then you're writing another record. Well, you could be out touring a record for 2 years. You could also be in the studio making 10, 12 different, completely different records.
Right.
And that was, as someone that just likes music, that was appealing.
So yeah, it seems like, you know, you made the best choice and you trusted your gut and your intuition in that moment. And now looking back, like you're very happy about the decision. And yeah, it seems like you're very much into the studio life. And I think to work at somewhere like NRG for that long and to last for that long, like you obviously learn very quickly that about yourself. Like this is where I feel most comfortable. This is where I feel at home. This is what I want to do for, you know, the rest of my life. And it became your career. So yeah, I mean, what do you have to say about like, cause I find it's like everyone has different opinions about this kind of a thing, like, you know, audio engineers, mixers, producers, and et cetera. But like, do you feel that, like, if you were looking back and you could tell yourself, like, what advice would you give yourself, you know, however many years ago you first started at NRG, like what you know now, like, what would you tell yourself then?
I probably would have jumped ship out of there sooner. So, you know, I started working there in 2002. You know, Napster had just happened. Just downloading was a thing in general. And a lot of studios were closing in LA. And I actually started at a place called the Enterprise. It's still there. It's like on Magnolia. It's like the Enterprise Evergreen experience. And at the time, like Dave Pensado was doing a bunch of stuff there. And it was like Ja Rule Ashanti. This is all explaining how old I am. Ja Rule Ashanti, like Mariah Carey, stuff like that. And I really just like, but they also had another building that had like a music studio. And then they did post, they did DVD authoring. But I got stuck working in that building at night. So I was just like, I am not really learning anything. So I just really didn't dig it. So I'd gotten offered jobs at Enterprise and NRG around the same time. And NRG was part-time, Enterprise was full-time, and studio running is minimum wage. So I was like, I need full-time.
Oh, shit. Yeah.
So I was doing that and I didn't like it. I think I'm getting completely distracted from the answer. Yeah, I'm not sure where I'm going with this.
Oh, it was just like, what would you tell yourself
Oh,
then?
what would I tell myself?
Yeah.
So I've met people, initially when people came to LA, especially ones from Tennessee, like a lot of my professors would put them in touch with me, and I've had people ask since. And it's weird because I got into the industry in an era that like doesn't exist anymore. Like you don't go work at a studio and work your way up really anymore. I mean, you still do,
it's
but
very rare. Like I was at, I mean, there's Sunset Sound is still thriving and they do that.
Yeah.
There's like a few studios that do the traditional thing, but you're right. It's very rare.
I think, when I applied to NRG and, you know, I was applying a record plant, there was probably 100 studios that I applied to that I would have considered like, I did like A, B, and C tier. And a lot of like Music Grinder, there's just a ton of studios that just aren't there anymore.
Yeah.
And then I think 5 years later when I was like, because everything slowed down, like people weren't getting promoted to NRG as quickly. It also kind of got labeled the new metal studio. So, you know, like Puddle of Mud's second record is not, other than like Linkin, like nobody's second record was getting big. So there was, so I was like, oh, maybe I should look around again. And I was like, oh man, there's only like 25, 30 comparable studios. So I came in, when I did that, the big studio thing, that was the norm, and you can still do it, but like, it's not really the norm now. The norm's more really what you're doing, like having a space and kind of working or
just working at home with your laptop.
Yeah. Or, you know, being hired directly to work with someone, you know, my first summer, my internship with LA, internship in LA, I was like, oh, we're getting this 001 running into a Mackie D8B via like a light pipe. And that was a big deal. And that wasn't normal. And like, that's how people work now. So there are things that you pick up doing that I think are still valuable skills, like kind of the work ethic. And the great thing about big studio life is you do meet a lot of people. You know, even that studio I was just mentioning that I didn't really care for working at, I met this guy, Andrew Chavez, and then we worked together years later with Linda Perry. Like I still am in touch with that guy. So there's that. You learn a lot just by experiencing working for a lot of different engineers. And that's good because that's, to a degree, it's experience you can't get doing things on your own.
Totally, man. Yeah.
But it's also a grind. Like it doesn't pay well. It's really competitive. The hours are crap. Like I basically spent my entire 20s at NRG. Like food runs all day for Limp Bizkit and then get off. And then like whose band's demo can I make in the downtime and like on the Neve rooms. So
when you're there, did you move up to like, intern, runner, assistant, engineer? Like how far did you get in their hierarchy?
I mean, they don't really go above us. You're kind of assistant, and then like you're considered like a staff engineer as
Okay.
well. And it depends on how long you've been there and how good you are at assisting as to like what clients they'll trust you with, I guess, is
Yeah.
kind of the way it works. Like you start out with like the owner's friend or, this less serious one. And then you kind of like
Yeah.
work your way up. Yeah.
Well, what you said about, when you work at these bigger studios, yeah, you have the benefit of working with, bigger name musicians. So you've had a lot of experience with that, and I think what you can't learn when you're a home like at home producer or bedroom producer, what they call it, like, is the etiquette. And you've worked with so many different artists, and I know every artist is different and responds differently and has a different vibe and is more sensitive to certain things, less sensitive to certain things. So how important to how did you learn etiquette, and was it a bit challenging at first, or you seem like a people person, and you can read people and you have that gift just from what I'm observing about you. But what would you say about that? I mean, I think the studio vibe, the studio environment, it takes a certain it takes intuition, it takes psychology, reading the room, reading the client, reading how the artist is performing. So tell us a little bit about how you navigated those waters.
I think you're right. I think to a degree there was I had some pretty decent people skills. We moved a lot when I was a kid. So you just get used to meeting people, and I didn't really fit in the Deep South. So you kind of learn to navigate being somewhere where you don't really relate to a lot of the people that you're around. And so that helped. I mean, I worked at a restaurant a bit in college. That actually helped. And with some of the studios I applied for, I was like, oh, I've worked as a waiter. I know studio runners have to get food orders. I have experience. But yeah, part of it's personality, and it's weird to watch people, and I had a really great internship with this hip hop producer named Dave Aaron. And we would go to big studios, and I would kind of observe which assistants he liked and which ones he didn't, and kind of what they were doing. But yeah, over the years, just some interns would be great. Some runners would great. I mean, I would meet people that were great engineers, but oh, you're a weird vibe. You're not going to get bigger. But even some of the, I worked with producers later where we would have interns, and we would be working on something, and interns well, you should do this and you should do that. And it's just and it was, I remember one, it was his first or second day, and the producer I was working for just kind of gave this turn and looked at him. I was you just, man, don't.
Fired.
Not so much fired, but he definitely got phased out of our internship program. Versus I don't know, some people just read the situation well and some don't, and it's interesting because you have to know how to read the situation, and then you have to learn how to react in that situation, because you are in a soundproof room with people, one room for 12 hours a day easily, 6-7 days a week. You have to be able to read okay, this is the session where they want you to be outgoing, this is the session where you just shut up and do your job.
Right. Yeah, that's another major thing I learned too, is I feel like artists, musicians, when you're working with them as an engineer, producer, whatever, I feel like it benefits you the more you can mirror their vibe, the better. If they're chill and just laid back and soft spoken, and they get in their creative vibe that way, it really helps to match that, instead of being if you're an intense personality, that might be too much for them. So I felt from my experience, it helps to mirror who you're working with. Sometimes maybe not, but if someone's really extroverted and loud and go, I find if you can kind of mirror that to your best ability, then they feel you're on the same page. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? Yeah.
I remember once assisting this producer, Matt Squire, who does a lot of pop punk stuff. And it was the first time he came to NRG, and kind of getting him set up and showing him around the room and kind of get things going. And then I'll refrain from naming the band. It was a pop punk band. Excuse me. But he's I'm letting you know now that I'm going to get a little broy. He's because it's just this band's vibe. There's a certain way I need to work. I need to do a certain thing. I may cue you in that I need a certain type of energy interaction with him. And I'm just giving you the heads up now. So he's don't think I flip into douchebag mode when I'm working. But he's this is just kind of the vibe that works with them. And I was okay, cool. And so you even kind of learn that at a studio, people that, you know, like a lot of those people have way different vibes. Like,
And some of them will feel like, even if you're great at engineering or producing, for some of them, if you're not like there with them on their level, they're just turned off. They're like, I don't want to work with this person, even if they're doing great work. Like they're not feeling it. So
yeah.
it's like sometimes that happens, you know. So yeah, I try to. I think it's important to try to match the vibe, but unless like sometimes, you know, sometimes people are like, if they're really mellow and you know, they're focusing in on the session, but if you're too laid back as well and you're not like on it, then sometimes that throws people off too. So it kind of like, it just depends on the artist and the situation, and kind of it's good to kind of feel that out, you know, as you go along the sessions. So yeah. Okay, so I want to pivot a little bit and talk to you about, you worked for quite a while with Linkin Park, and I'm sure that was an amazing experience. So what was your main, like, what do you feel was your main takeaway and your main lesson, like, as an audio engineer from working with them?
I worked with Lincoln a long time. I met them when I was a student runner. Like they came in the first year I was a runner. And then like I assisted on some stuff, and I went from kind of assisting to like, basically they're like, hey, can you chop drums? I was like, yeah. And they kind of let me chop drums because at that point we had a rapport, and they're like, oh, he doesn't usually screw stuff up. Like we'll give him a shot. And so I kind of worked my way into, and also with like their main engineer, this guy, Ethan Mates, who's a good friend of mine now. Linkin Park records take a really long time, like easily a year and a half, 2 years. So he would be like, oh, this is great. Like they're comfortable with Josh. Josh knows what he's doing. I need a day off. So it's, gosh, I learned a lot with Lincoln, because the interesting things about Lincoln, one, it's really cool to be able to do records on that size budget. And I'm not even talking about like food budget, but like you're in a nice studio, you're using good equipment, you're not rushing through things. Like you're really genuinely getting to take your time. They write in the studio, which is interesting. So, you know, I know they just put out like a new version of Meteora, and it had like, oh, these unreleased songs. And I'm like, yeah, they have, I don't think I'm doing anything here. Like they have dozens of those, because when you're that big and you're making records that big, like you may make 40 songs and only 10 of them end up on your record.
Yeah, just vaulting them.
So that was a good lesson in like, even just me as a musician in a band, or even work, they were just like, hey, we're going to write and we're going to pick the best ones, and we're going to, you know, we have 100 songs, and then let's narrow it down to 50 that we like. And, you know, they're a 6-member band, right? 6. They vote on it like, all right, now let's narrow that down again and cut it in half, and let's get it down to 20, and then let's focus on this 15, and then out of those we're gonna pick the best 10. And they were not precious about getting rid of stuff, and you could keep stuff and like maybe revisit, but that was a good lesson in like really making sure that you're doing the cream of the crop, because the records I made with them were very much when they wanted to be in kind of like an experimental phase. It turned into like, just, hey, let's like look into bit crusher things and weird analog pedals. And,
Nice.
you know, one record was kind of their take on Refused Shape of Punk to Come. Like, they would literally just like give me and Ethan money, like go get stuff to do something like that. And
Hell yeah.
so it was a really cool, like you would just do research into all these different recordings, or we would work with all these different people, especially their last record, like Robin Fink comes in and, you know, worked with Rick Rubin on stuff, and just like everybody from these big pop songwriters to guys from System of a Down or Nine Inch Nails coming by. So, but the thing with them was, because they're very private, was like I was part of the team because I'd known them for a long time. So I kind of had that in. It was, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think like there's no quick answer to this question really. Like, you know, that was my first time engineering my only time engineering for Rick Rubin. We're working on Linkin stuff, like kind of learning how to navigate Rick, who's a very interesting person. You know, I'm trying to think what we didn't do with Linkin. I mean, you know, records where you'd have 40 different versions of a song worked on with 10 different producers, and like putting that all into a session and making it work, or
holy shit.
You know, just seeing these professional vocal producers come in and how that stuff works. So Lincoln was really like kind of this master class in everything from studio etiquette, because some days they're in a good mood, some days they're not. Some days they're riding with somebody and like you're hanging out all day, and then some days you're editing, some days you're tracking,
Yeah.
some days you're playing the part because like they're having trouble figuring it out. And yeah, like it really just was. And I guess the other thing to me, it was the first time with Linkin, and then I kind of experienced it later with like doing stuff like Avril Lavigne and stuff like that also, is you're not just making a record at that point. Like you're making a product that's going to be mass marketed. So there are business meetings involved and tie-ins. Like it was kind of this look into just how big a record can be and how many other moving parts there are when you're, one of the main focuses for your record label.
Yeah. So in these maybe more stressful sessions where I'm sure there were times when all the band members were in the room with you at once, maybe more people, how did you, like, what were some techniques you used maybe during stressful sessions where you're having to experience multiple personalities at once and maybe conflicts? Like what kind of advice would you give to, new engineers and producers, like, to keep your cool in these kinds of situations?
I mean, definitely have a game face and get a hobby. I did. This has been long enough now. I think I can talk about it. At one point, the band, we were working on this record for so long, they decided they wanted to fill the live room at NRG with balloons. Right.
Why?
And I'm like, they're like, we want a different vibe. And I'm like, okay. I very much let them know that I hate the balloons. So I feel like if this ever gets back to them, it's fine.
Wait, you told them that you hated balloons?
No. I told them that I hated the balloon thing. Because, I mean, we worked on records subsequently, and it was kind of a going joke after the fact. In fact, when my now wife first met Mike Shinoda, she's like, so these balloons? So, like, they know. So I thought, like, oh, they want, like, a few hundred balloons and haha. Because you've probably been in the live rooms at NRG. Yeah. It's like a 25 by 25 foot room. So I did that. They asked that on a Friday. They come in Monday, and there's, like, 300 or 400 balloons. Like, I called a party rental place. And they're like, this is great. When are the rest going to get here?
Oh, God.
And I was like, what do you mean? And they're like, no, we want like balloons.
Oh, my God.
And I was like, how many? And the guitarist's like, let's have a balloon meeting. And I'm like, all right. And I was just like already having a busy day. So we had this like, how many do you want? What color? So basically they want it waist deep in the live room.
Jeez.
And I'm like, okay. And I was like, well, here are my concerns, like people tripping over mic cables or things popping and getting into like the vintage tube mics.
Yeah.
And he was like, that's kind of on you to figure out, isn't it? I was like, yeah, all right, fine. And just kind of leave and like walk up. And it's like, I don't know, order me 4,000 balloons from a party rental place. And a van shows up with like these giant, like condom looking things full of inflated balloons. And you just,
God.
But I guess in me being like, fine, I'll figure it out. And this was kind of really early on into me working my way up the food chain. Like I did already know them, but I still was technically the assistant and then doing Pro Tools editing.
So they sent testing you.
They sent Ethan out, and Ethan's like, he's like, I was told to maybe mention to you to like check your attitude in the balloon meetings. I was like, you're right. I'm sorry.
Wow.
By the way, don't ever fill a studio with balloons. It's terrible.
Sounds like a pain in the ass.
But
if you're trying to record in there as well.
Yeah, popping, tripping over mic cables. But it was funny. One of the things we did, because you're on this record for a long time, was we got into Legos. We got like that huge Millennium Falcon that Lego made 10 years ago.
Sweet.
And, band needs to write for 2 hours and files are backed up and editing's done and you don't want to play channel surf in the lounge anymore. Like Legos. Like, I don't know, like find something like that. So that turned into a thing for me. Like I would buy later when I was like kind of the editor and end of the evening, like you're doing all the editing and then I'm backing up 6 different hard drives and coalescing all this data. It was just like, when I went to Target to get laundry detergent, whatever, I'd get like a $10 Lego set. And it was just like something to do to keep my brain occupied.
That sounds that sounds very like therapeutic actually, to unplug from all the busyness and just focus in on something simple like that, or like puzzles or like that for me, like therapeutic.
Yeah.
And just chill and just focus on one thing. Yeah, that sounds cool. So
I'm still diehard about like I still buy Legos and have a couple sets like at the house. Just, yeah, I don't know. But there's something that it ended up being something that was relaxing.
Hell yeah.
And you can do it in a small space and it's quiet. So
it's quiet. Yeah. Okay. So they're obviously testing you, but obviously you passed because you worked with them for a while.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, just, I guess from what I'm gathering from the question is just keep your cool, have a game face, and just do whatever they request up to a certain point, I'm sure. But
Yeah,
like,
I mean, it's going to get frustrating. Every session is going to get frustrating. Like I have bands that I love working with that we've done the countless, like this band Intronaut. I've done like 6 records with them. The joke is I'm the 5th member. Like, yeah, we're all buddies. Like even making, I mean, you know this, making records can just get stressful. It's a creative process. Sometimes you're not sleeping enough because you're, you know, Linkin, you're doing a record for 2 years. Another band, you might be doing a record in a week and just not sleeping. So, yeah, I don't know. I also have 2 small children, so kind of like you learn to check you can't scream at a time. I mean, you can, but you just learn to like check those things. But I don't think there's any one piece of advice that can be like, oh, this will help you navigate it. But
yeah,
I think, especially in a band, if you're dealing with like a collection of artists that big, or like I said, I worked with Avril Lavigne for a bit, or I worked with Puff Daddy for a while. And like when you're dealing with, I don't want to say egos, but I can't think of a better person. Let's go with personality. Like big personalities, people that have been successful for a long time too. There is like, you just kind of learn how to navigate it. Sometimes like you're going to be friendly. Sometimes like you really do just work for them. And it's figuring out that angle. It's figuring out, figuring out your niche there. I mean, working with Rick's obviously like a big thing. And we were doing acoustic guitars once, and we have like a 251 and acoustic, and it's just me and Rick in the control room, and the guitarist is working on something, and then he gets done playing and he goes like this, right? And he looks off, and Rick is doing that Rick thing where he's laying on the couch in the back, and he's like, "What just happened?" I was like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Why does it sound different?" And I was like, "Oh, he moved off the microphone." And Rick just goes, "Well, that shouldn't matter." And
what?
I'm just like, "You're Rick Rubin.
Do you think
you're the client?"
Yeah. I mean, do you think he really thinks that, or is that just something like kind of
yeah,
psychedelic he's saying?
Yeah, that's the
You know
mental
what I
thing
mean?
in my head right there. While I'm doing I'm like, he has to know that if you move away from a microphone, it gets quieter. And I was like, okay. Well, he's like, yeah, that shouldn't matter. I was like, okay, let me go fix it. Like, turn the speakers off. I walked out into the live room. Brad's a guitarist, and I was like, hey, Brad, can you please do me a small favor? When you moved off microphone, like you going off mic and the sound all changed, like threw Rick out of his like creative zone.
Yeah.
Do you mind staying on the microphone? And Brad was like, oh yeah, I don't want to like throw off his vibe. And so I came back in the control room. It's like, oh, I fixed it and turned the monitors back up.
Yeah.
And Rick was like, okay, thank you. And so that's part of it. Like, that's part of it too, is just learn creative problem solving, I guess. That's I don't know. But like, you just learn to navigate those things.
Do you think a part of that was him kind of like testing you too a little bit? Because I mean, he has to know that. You know what I mean?
I don't think he was testing me. I think it was just like, I think it was his way of saying like, I don't want this to change.
Yeah. Okay, gotcha. Okay, so
I mean, that's, sorry to cut you off. That's reading it too. Like when I was working with Puff Daddy, I got working with this producer who, like, you'd be flying parts around. Like a hip hop, you can like really move pieces in blocks. Yeah. This is all programmed. And you would do things. He's like, that's not right. But the way he was wording it made it sound like I did it wrong. And I was like, oh, but I thought that's where you. And it took me about 20 minutes to realize, like, oh, this is his way of saying, like, I have this idea and I'm playing it back. And he's going, that's not like.
Gotcha.
The way he was saying it wasn't clear, but it's him going like, okay, this idea isn't working. But he was phrasing it weird. So there's a lot of reading people. So like it's kind of like, have patience, but they're also, and I don't need to go into horror stories, but there are also times like you just need to stand up for yourself.
True.
As well.
True.
So you have to like find those lines and choose your battles.
Yeah. And I've learned too that, over the years, you refine your skills, you learn more and more about the technical side of engineering. But from my experience, like every time you go to work with a new artist you never worked with, it's like you're starting over, because like we were just talking about, you have to learn how that artist likes to work, how they like to communicate, everything about that artist is completely different than the person you worked with previously, and maybe like all the other people. So in a way, like from my experiences, like as much as I learn every year and I feel like I'm progressing on a technical level and maybe on a creative level, it's also like, okay, that's great, but this new person is works completely different than anybody else I've ever worked with. So I have to start over basically, and just like have an open mind and learn them really. So I'm sure, like you said, sometimes the artist wants to keep it strictly professional, and they make that clear pretty early on. So you can pick up on that and calibrate to that. Some artists like tell you their deepest, darkest secrets on day one. It's like the weirdest thing. So you have to like, you know, yeah, read it and learn how the artist wants to move forward and how they want to work really.
Yeah. And I will say, I think at the end of the day, I think them being comfortable with you and your personal skills probably trump your professional skills a little bit, at least as far as like being a tracking engineer.
Yeah.
Or a lot of that stuff. And I don't say that just about me, like having met some professional, like vocal producers and songwriters and producers that came in, and it was just like, oh, this is kind of like, you're a little bit smoke and mirrors here, but I get like your vibe is like making the artist excited, and that's kind of your thing. Yeah,
absolutely. So what for you has been one of the biggest like aha moments in your career, like as a mixer engineer? Like was there a few, like what was one of the major things that like opened created like an epiphany for you, like something, maybe a mix technique, maybe a some kind of perception or way of thinking about a certain thing? Like was there anything that comes to mind right away that like really changed it for you?
I mean, the first time I like got to use a bunch of like nice mics, 2 mics through a Neve and track something, it was like, oh yeah, that's a big one. Like that's way bigger than tracking my buddy's PV in college with a 57 through like a whatever. I'm trying to think. I think a lot of that has to do, like I still have a lot of aha moments. A lot of it has to do with aesthetics. You know, there are things like the studios I worked at in the background I didn't do a lot of like amp sims and stuff like that. So like I feel really late to the game on that. So I'm doing a lot of aha moments with that. I'm trying to think. There were I can't like nail down specific ones, but there were things where it's just like, you know, learning things like the artist being comfortable goes a long way into getting a good take or getting a good sound. Or I think one of the big things, because I think a lot of people, and this isn't to shit on anybody, there's a lot of people right now that are trying to learn like, oh, this is how you mic a kick drum, and this is how you do this, and this is the EQ you put on this, and there was a big aha moment, not specific moment, but just along the way of working at NRG, where you're working with all these different people that do things so differently. People could be like, I hate that kick drum mic, and I always use this one, and they would get some amazing kick drum session. And then the next session you're doing, they're saying it like the exact opposite way. Like they love the kick drum mic that just got kicked off the last session and hate the one that got used.
Right.
And just like learning how some people do things, and there was just like a million little things along the way. Like, hey, you know, start rolling low end out of these things so it doesn't build up your mix. Or like, this is where you can take high end out. Or like, you know, I don't, it's probably, I don't know that I could start pointing to like, oh, this exact thing. I mean, there are those things. There's like, you know, the engineer that was cool, because when I started at NRG, I'd used Pro Tools a little bit in college, but like the guy that sat me down was like, okay, this is basic drum chopping 101. This is basic vocal tuning 101. Mm-hmm. And like I just a notepad and I'm like writing it down. So there was stuff like that. But as far as there's just, to me, it's more like there's constantly a bunch of little things you learn. Like there's always a different approach to things. And you know, in talking to people and all that. So I don't know that I could say like, oh, here's a specific this, here's a specific that.
Gotcha. Yeah, I like what you said about, you know, the different mindsets on miking and whatnot, because I've experienced that too. Like maybe you get to work with, you know, a really famous mixer or producer that you've admired, and they do something one way that sounds amazing and maybe it's an idea you've never thought of, but then you work with someone else and it completely like shits on that idea, but it also sounds awesome. So it's like, it can be very confusing, but at the end of the day, it's just about it's just about like creating your own style and doing what works for you, and not caring, oh, I really like how this mic sounds on this source, even though these amazing, creative, awesome people hate it and think it's shit. Like I like it. So you know what I mean?
Well, really, like when I was still in this moment, we got asked to be on like a Slayer compilation that never ended up coming out for this LA label Media Scare. So we did Postmortem. And you know, like Slayer has that guitar sound. So I'm working at NRG, like, oh, great, we'll just do stuff there. They have like all the hot rodded Marshalls, like, great, we go in. And it was just an E, like we normally played in B, but like it's just an E. So we could even use like the Les Pauls here. Like, so we set all this stuff up and got the Neve, and like we're going through like the custom JSM 800s. Nah, this isn't quite right. This isn't quite right. But our guitarist had rolled in with like his Ibanez 7-string, and he had a crate Blue Voodoo.
I remember
Like
those.
the crate.
Yeah, I
tube
like
heads.
those.
Yeah, so we're trying all these things like, fuck it, let's just put a 57 on that. And it sounded great. So we did all the guitars through that. And I mean, this was way back when I still had stuff on MySpace and I was like doing people's demos that way. All these people were like, what's the guitar tone on that recording? And I was like, it's a crate. You will never. And it was one of those things where it was really early on. I was like, oh yeah, sometimes people just have their sound.
Right.
Although I did feel vindicated. I was recently listening to a songwriting podcast where they're interviewing Fletcher from Pennywise about doing guitar tones on a record he did with, I think, Joe Barresi.
Sick.
And Fletcher was just like, oh yeah, I had this crate Blue Voodoo. And he was like, it was this expensive crate tube amp that nobody wanted to spend that much money for. And I made Joe try it out. And even he was like, oh, no, this is pretty good.
I had one of those.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, I sold it. But that was, I like, every other crate sounds like shit. But that one had a magic to it. It was very, very, very good. But yeah, I wonder if any of those are floating around. I should probably want to get one of those again. But yeah, dude, like totally. I mean, I think, yeah, like creating your own tone and your own sound, that as a guitarist, as a vocalist, as an engineer, I think it's just about whatever works for you. But yeah, like that's another thing that was an aha moment for me was once I started working with some of the more expensive vintage gear, I noticed that it only amplifies, like it laser focuses in on the performance. So just because you're using something that's better, that actually, and if you're not prepared and if your performance isn't like spot on, it might sound worse because it's so laser focused in. You're like, oh my God, that's what I sound like. Like I've had quite a few experiences with that. Like when I was a little bit not so far into my career and I started to, work with some of this stuff and tracking, younger musicians that weren't too far along and still developing their skills, but it's like it puts a microscope like on your performance. So I found that okay, I'm using this really nice gear, but it's too good. It's too laser focused on this performance, and actually using maybe the M-Box pre like sounds better for them because they're not tight enough, right? So that was a big one for me too.
Yeah, it's kind of like not being precious with how to get the right results.
Yeah,
I actually did think of an aha moment that happened maybe like 5-6 years ago. I was out to dinner with like a group of producer engineers, and I met Bo Burchell that evening. And I like Bo's stuff a lot, and we had a bunch of mutual friends, and we just got talking. But at one point, we got talking about, because he does a lot of mixing, and I was not doing a lot of mixing at that point. Like I just did a ton of tracking because I worked at a studio where people would just come in and track drums. Like, you're not going to come in. People weren't renting big Neve rooms at that point for that. And we were having this great conversation about mix references and how rare it is that that's literally what the person wants.
Yeah.
They will reference an album, and that's not actually what they want. And his analogy was, he's like, it's Appetite for Destruction. And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, everybody loves Appetite for Destruction. And they'll be like, we want this to feel like Appetite for Destruction. He's like, then you put Appetite for Destruction on, and they don't want it to sound like Appetite for Destruction. They want it to sound like the way they think Appetite for Destruction sounds in their head. Like the way they get pumped up when they hear Welcome to the Jungle. He's like, that's what you have to figure out. It's not you're actually going to reference this exact thing. You have to, I mean, it even happened with, like on a record I did the first Black Veil Brides record, because I've known Blasco a long time, and he was like, oh, I want this to sound like Motley Crue. So me and the guy that did it, we're like, okay. We're listening to these like 80s Motley Crue records, and we kind of got like, all right, like whatever, let's do it. And then it came time to mix, and the mix got kind of really rushed because we had some mix up on mixed delivery dates. I was literally doing Linkin Park and then trying to mix Black Veil Brides in the downtime. You were talking about the John Corabi Motley Crue record that Bob Rock did.
Oh, okay.
And like it being this big punchy thing where we were thinking like, so that was, I mean, I wish I'd had that conversation with Bo before I mixed that record because it made more sense. But that was one of those things when Bo gave me that aha moment about like, it's the way they feel about this album. I was like, oh yeah, no, it's the way you feel listening to Bob Rock's Motley Crue record with John Corabi, where it's like, okay, no, now I get what you meant Like I wish I could go back and redo that record, but
Oh yeah, I've experienced that quite a few times too. Like, earlier it's like it's very rarely is it okay, they send the reference, but it's more about the feeling they get from it, not the exact kick drum sound or the snare drum sound or the guitars. It's like it's how they react to the feeling of the song, and that's what they're going for. Because the reality is I mean, no matter how hard you try, you can't match it anyway. You know what I mean? So it's like
no matter how many people ask for the drums for 10,000 days, like they're just not gonna
exactly
gonna get it.
Yeah. Excuse me. So yeah, I totally, man, I could totally relate to that. So before we wrap it up, I want to ask you, this is the themed question of the podcast, and feel free to reject it and I'll edit it out if you'd like. But what was one of the darkest moments in your career, and what did you do to overcome it, and how did it make you the person you are today?
I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, Chester committing suicide was obviously a very big thing. One, it was somebody I knew. I wouldn't say like we were like close friends, but we were, how to word it. Ethan, the other Linkin Park engineer, I think he worded it great one day. He's like, oh, there've been plenty of weeks I've spent more time with that guy than I have my own family. And so, yeah, we weren't friends, not like I'm hanging out with him, but we were friendly. Like, he was one of the more outgoing people. So, that was like a really big point in my career for a lot of reasons. There was, I mean, someone dying, especially like really like committing suicide in a very violent manner. It does make you sit back and be like, oh, like, did I miss something? We'd been out of the studio for 5 or 6 months at that point, but you're just like, oh, was there some signs that I missed that I should have helped with? But also then from kind of a career standpoint, what really happened at that point in my career, I think we worked on that Linkin Park record for almost 2 years. So it had gotten to a point with my career where I just wasn't looking for a lot of outside work because I worked with them so much. And people knew I was always working with them. So this was what was making freelancing for me difficult between their records. I was gone so much of the time that filling in the gaps between records was getting difficult because people are like, oh, you're just always busy, so we assume. So we had made that record. I think that wrapped in January. Well, that wrapped in January 2017. My son was born like 2 weeks after we finished. And I was like, oh, I'm just going to take some time off. We just came off this big record. And they kind of we had so many songs, they wanted to go back in that fall. And I was like, all right, I'm going to do something I never do. I'm just going to take the year off because I want to be around. I have a son. I already know I have this work lined up.
Yeah.
Lincoln's going to be summer touring, so I'll be helping with like all the live release. Like I know I have work this year. I'm good. And then that happened, like kind of just this touring was firing up. So it was on a couple levels, it was very tragic on a personal level. And it was also becoming a new father at that point, and like him leaving kids, like realizing like, oh man, you must have been, depression's a real bitch. Like you must have been in a really bad space to like leave your kids. And I don't say that as a judgment thing. So it was also like this big reckoning on mental health and things like that. Like I started going to see a therapist afterwards just because I was like, oh, I talked to some people and I was like, there's some things that maybe I should address. And doing that, and then kind of like my career taking a big pause like I'd already taken half the year off at that point because this is like July-ish. It's like, oh, okay, I don't have work the rest of the year. I have a new mouth to feed. I'm trying to figure some stuff out in my head. This like tragic thing has happened. Like I'm trying to wrap my brain around. So that was a really massive point in like my engineering career going forward. I ended up like, I worked with other people. I found stuff. I still kind of do a little bit with like Mike Shinoda every now and then when he needs stuff. Like I kind of spent that year working with some people, and I met some other producers, engineers, but I was still like trying to fill in these gaps. And it's also a weird thing to start like calling people, to be like, hey, so as you may know, my main gig isn't my main gig anymore. Like it's a weird, and I kind of hate talking about it because I hate talking about it in terms of business, but realistically it was also like I needed to make a living And that was how I was making my living.
Yeah.
And there just aren't a lot of rock bands that are operating on that level, that type of thing.
Yeah.
So I was like doing some pop and hip hop sessions. I was like, man, I'm out of the loop on this. And the hours with that was not what I wanted as a new father either. So that's what kind of like turned into, I started looking into post-production. I was doing stuff like mixing Netflix cartoons in Korean for like a post house where I had some ins. I was doing Foley work. And I just like started, it ended up being a good thing because I think I was also like really burned out on music at that point. I realized like I was doing music all the time and I wasn't listening to music as much anymore and I wasn't getting excited about it anymore because like music was kind of work.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was like it turned into, and like as you kind of know now, I do a lot of broadcasting and podcasting stuff, and I'm still doing music, which is cool because now I'm doing music I really like, which is like a lot of it's weird and not commercial, and there's not a budget for it. Where that used to work for me before because I would do these big Linkin records or whomever and have like kind of a nest egg, and then like, oh, your entire budget's what we spent on a day on that album. Like, cool. It was
Exactly.
like, oh, I don't really have it was like, okay, well, right now I'm not at a point where I could do that, and I've built up a alternate engineering career where I can do that stuff again. Like I'm going to be mixing some like doom metal record in July where it's like, they're like, it's only 5 songs, but it's like 50 minutes of music. It's like,
Yeah.
cool. Like I like that stuff, but God, if I was trying to pay my bills for 2 kids with that, it wouldn't work. So, so yeah, that was the big spot for me. It was like a big career reckoning. It was a big reckoning as a person. And, I think I'm still kind of technically working my way through it, but
Of course. Yeah. That's a major thing. Thank you for sharing that. I know it's a dark space and it's vulnerable, but could totally relate. You know, as you know, I had a close friend, Mike Wells, mastering engineer that I known for quite a while, and we shared a lot of great times together, but he also took his own life. So I understand like the weight of that. So, but thank you for sharing that. I know a lot of people will resonate with that, and it'll help them too, because it's fucking dark, dude. I totally get it. Yeah.
And I hope nobody ever has to experience reading what people say on the internet about what really happened to somebody you know is another.
Oh God.
As another really weird one.
Yeah.
But yeah. But no, and I think in the long run, it's been good. I like have fallen back in love with music. I'm playing more now. It kind of forced me to start like doing more mix work versus like tracking, editing, which has been good. And yeah, and like honestly, like part of it's freed up my schedule. Like I got kicked out of bands because they were just like, what are your hours on this record? And how long is this record going? Like I was in a band and the guitarist like, how long are you on this record? And this is we're gonna get a new bass player. And so it's, yeah, I mean, I'll totally equalize the situation, but there have been some, there's been some upsides to it too. So, you know.
Yeah, I mean, we do what we got to do. Like when the world changes, the industry changes, and you know you have to pivot to survive. And I've experienced the same thing where budgets are just gone, and like you have to do all kinds of different things to support yourself. So I totally get it, man. So where can people find you if they want to hit you up for mixing, for tracking? Where can people find you on the internet? On socials?
As we just found out, the contact on my website is not working. Josh-Newell.com. The contact is not working. So if you need to email, it's just joshnewell@me.com. Or I think Josh Newell Recordings is probably not the best Instagram handle, but I check my messages on there. I kind of have limited schedulability, but I still try to work on a bunch of like stuff. I'm doing some Guitar Hero. I'm sorry, not the game, but like 80s shred type stuff.
Nice
mixes on top of like mixing an adult contemporary Christian record that my friend played on. Like, I don't know. I'm still in like, if a project tickles my fancy, I'll figure out a way to fit it in. Right
on. Well, Josh, thank you so much for coming by and for having the chat. I know a lot of people are going to enjoy it, and I really enjoyed it. And thank you for your time. And yeah, man, appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on.
Of course. Cheers.